Mom, we have no space for you, my son, Mark, said, his voice trying for gentle but landing somewhere near brittle. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, he stared at a spot on the gleaming granite countertop, the one I'd picked out 2 years ago. I followed his gaze. A single crumb, probably from my granddaughter Lily's morning toast, sat defiantly on the polished surface. It seemed so small, so insignificant, in the vast, open-plan kitchen of this very large house. A house with 5 bedrooms, a finished basement, and a 2-car garage. No space. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like the humid summer air before a storm. I looked from my son's tense shoulders to my daughter-in-law, Sarah, who stood beside him, a pillar of false sympathy. Her hand was on his arm, a gesture meant to look supportive but felt more like a vice. And then, a strange sound bubbled up from my chest. It was a laugh. A dry, quiet, creaking thing that startled all 3 of us. Let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and subscribe to the channel, because I promise you, this is just the beginning of a story you won't be able to forget. Sarah's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up towards her hairline. Evelyn? Are you all right? She asked, her voice laced with the kind of condescending concern one usses for a confused child. My laugh died in my throat, but a smile remained, stretched tight across my lips. It must have looked terrifying, because Mark finally flinched and looked at me. His face was a mess of guilt and weak resolve. He was a good boy, my Mark. He'd always been a good boy. But a good boy can be shaped into something else by the right pair of hands. I looked at Sarah's manicured fingers, still gripping his arm, and I knew exactly whose hands had done the shaping. All right? I repeated, my voice steady, surprising even myself. Oh yes, dear. I'm perfectly all right. The lie felt smooth on my tongue. Inside, a dam of grief and fury was cracking, but not a single drop would be allowed to spill. Not yet. The house was bought with my money. Every last brick, every window pane, every blade of grass in the manicured lawn they were so proud of. It was all paid for by the secret I had carried for a decade, a weight that had settled deep in my bones. They didn't know. They thought they had achieved this life, this sprawling suburban monument to success, all on their own. They thought the bank had given them a miracle loan. They thought my living here, in the smallest guest room tucked away by the laundry, was a matter of their charity, their kindness. A burden they had patiently shouldered and were now, ever so politely, shrugging off. My laugh had been the sound of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her child's happiness, only to find that he was now trying to bill her for the accommodations. The irony was so bitter it was almost sweet. They had a whole speech prepared, I could tell. Sarah took the lead, her voice slipping into a practiced, gentle rhythm. We found a wonderful place, Evelyn. It's called Golden Meadows. It's more of a community than a home. You'll have friends your own age, activities. There's a garden club and nurses on site, just in case. She slid a glossy brochure across the island. On the cover, a group of silver-haired seniors were laughing, their teeth impossibly white, as they played a game of shuffleboard. It looked like a prison for the cheerful. It's for your own good, she added, the final, classic line of a benevolent tyrant. We're just so worried about you being here alone all day while we're at work and Lily's at school, alone. I was alone now, sitting at this counter, but I hadn't been until they started making me feel that way. I remembered when they first moved in, when Lily was just a baby. The house was filled with noise and life. I was the one who walked the floors with a colicky Lily at 3 a.m. so Mark and Sarah could sleep. I was the one who potty trained her, taught her to read her first words while Sarah was busy climbing the corporate ladder at her marketing firm. I wasn't alone all day. I was the silent, unpaid, live-in foundation of their perfect life. And like any foundation, I was meant to remain invisible, underground, and uncomplaining. The moment I developed a creak, a bad knee, a forgotten appointment, the structure was deemed compromised. It was time for a renovation. I see, I said, my voice still unnervingly calm. I picked up the brochure. The paper was thick and expensive. It looks lovely. Mark let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he first spoke. He saw my compliance as acceptance, the path of least resistance. It was what he was used to from me. My late husband, David, always used to say I was like a river. Quiet, steady, finding my way around obstacles without a fuss. But he also knew that a river, given enough pressure, can carve through stone. Mark had forgotten that part. "We can go for a tour tomorrow," Mark said, his relief making him bold. "I'll take the morning off work." "Of course, dear," I said, folding the brochure neatly in half. "Whatever you think is best." The rest of the day passed in a surreal haze. I retreated to my room, the small space they had so generously allotted me. It was sparse. A bed, a dresser, a small armchair where I'd read stories to Lily. Most of my possessions, the remnants of a life lived with David for 45 years, were in a storage unit. To keep the house from feeling cluttered, Sarah had explained when we moved. I hadn't fought her. I hadn't fought her on anything. It was part of the deal I'd made with myself, with David's memory. I sat in the armchair, the brochure for Golden Meadows in my lap, and let the past wash over me. David. My sweet, brilliant, foolish David. He was an engineer, a man who could build bridges but couldn't balance a checkbook to save his life. He trusted everyone, especially a smooth-talking investment advisor who promised to double our retirement savings in 6 months. By the time the man vanished, so had our life savings. All of it. The shame nearly destroyed David. It wasn't the loss of money he mourned, but the loss of the future he had promised me, the security he had promised our son. Then the diagnosis came. A cancer that moved with the speed and ruthlessness of a wildfire. In his last lucid days, he gripped my hand, his knuckles white. "Protect Mark," he'd whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Don't let him know his old man was a fool. Don't let him struggle like I did. Promise me, Evie. Promise me," I promised. It was the last real conversation we ever had. After he was gone, the grief was a physical thing, a cloak so heavy it was hard to breathe. I was preparing to sell our small, paid-off home, the one we'd raised Mark in, just to have enough to live on. I was sorting through his paperwork, a mountain of memories and bills, when I found it. Tucked away in a dusty file labeled Old Policies was a life insurance plan from a company he'd worked for in his 20s. A small policy he'd paid into for a few years and then forgotten completely. For 40 years, it had been sitting there, quietly accumulating value. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a lifeline. It was enough. Enough for me to live comfortably. Enough to keep my promise. At that time, Mark and Sarah were newly married, living in a cramped apartment and drowning in student loan debt. Sarah was pregnant with Lily, and their dreams of a nice house in a good school district were crumbling. They were rejected for every mortgage they applied for. I watched my son's shoulders slump with the same defeated weight I'd seen in his father's. The echoes were too painful to bear. So I made a choice. I didn't tell them about the money. I knew Sarah. I knew her ambition. If she knew I had a nest egg, she would see it as a resource to be invested, to be used to fuel their lifestyle. And Mark, bless his heart, would have followed her lead. The money would have been gone in a few years, spent on fancy cars and designer clothes. It would not have provided the lasting security David wanted for his son. It would not have been a home. So I went to a lawyer, a shrewd old man named Mr. Harrison who had handled my parents' estate. We set up a trust. Through a series of complex, anonymous transactions, the trust provided a massive down payment for the house they'd fallen in love with. Then it began making the monthly mortgage payments directly to the bank. To Mark and Sarah, it looked like a miracle. The bank called them, citing a restructuring of their application and a new internal program that made them eligible. They never questioned it. Why would they? People don't question miracles that fall in their favor. My only condition, woven into my request to move in with them, was a quiet one. I wanted to live there, to watch my grandchild grow up. I told them I would contribute my small widow's pension to the household expenses, a pittance that made them feel generous for accepting it. They agreed, seeing me as a free babysitter and a minor financial contributor. They had no idea I was their benefactor, landlord, and bank all rolled into one. I was the ghost in their machine. A soft knock on my door pulled me from my thoughts. "Grandma?" Lily's small voice was a bomb. She slipped into the room, her little face clouded with worry. She was 7, with her father's kind eyes and a sensitivity that was all her own. She climbed into my lap, her small body fitting perfectly against mine. "Mommy says you're going to a new home. With lots of other grandmas," that's what she said, sweet pea. But I don't want you to go, she whispered, her voice trembling. Who will read me stories? Who will make the special pancakes? I hugged her tight, my throat aching. This was the cost. This little girl was the price of their ambition. I don't want to go either, Lily Bug, her small arms tightened around my neck. Then don't, she said with the simple, beautiful logic of a child. Just say no. I held her and rocked her, the way I had when she was a baby in this very house. And in the quiet of my small room, a new feeling began to displace the grief. It was cold and hard and clear. It was resolve. A river can be diverted, but it can also flood its banks, reclaiming the land that was always its own. The next morning, I was ready. I sat in the passenger seat of Mark's luxury SUV as he drove us to Golden Meadows. He chattered nervously about the amenities, the social calendar, the excellent level of care. He was selling it to me, but he was really selling it to himself, trying to convince himself that this act of familial banishment was actually a kindness, and the dining hall is supposed to be fantastic. Chef-prepared meals, Mom, he said, glancing at me, desperate for a sign of approval. You won't have to worry about cooking anymore. I just nodded, my gaze fixed on the scenery outside. The manicured lawns of our neighborhood gave way to busier streets. We were heading out of the bubble I had so carefully constructed for them. The tour was exactly what I expected. A smiling, overly cheerful director named Brenda showed us around. The place smelled of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. The residents we saw in the hallways had vacant eyes and forced smiles. They were neatly dressed and well cared for, like porcelain dolls on a shelf, waiting for a visit that might not come. Brenda pointed out the vibrant activity room where two women were listlessly knitting. She showed us the state-of-the-art medical wing, which looked and felt like a hospital. Then she led us to a model room. It was tiny, the size of my current room, but with a view of a parking lot. It had a single bed, a small wardrobe, and a tiny bathroom with grab bars everywhere. It was a room for waiting to die. It's just lovely, isn't it? Brenda chirped, her smile unwavering. Mark looked at me, his eyes pleading. It's nice, Mom, right? Safe. It's very practical, I said, my voice neutral. I could feel the walls closing in. This was the future they had planned for me, a practical, safe, beige box to be stored in until I was no longer a concern. As we walked back to the lobby, I saw an elderly man sitting in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at the traffic. A single tear traced a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. No one seemed to notice. My heart clenched. That would not be me. I would not sit by a window and weep. I would stand in my own home and fight. On the drive back, Mark was quiet. Perhaps even he, in his determined denial, could sense the profound sadness of that place. So he finally said as we pulled into our driveway, "What do you think?" I turned to him, my face a carefully composed mask of thoughtfulness. "I need some time to think about it, Mark." "It's a big decision." "Of course, Mom." "Take all the time you need," he said, the relief evident in his voice once again. He thought a little time was all I needed to surrender. He had no idea I was planning a war. That afternoon, while Sarah was at work and Lily was at a friend's house, I made my first move. I called Mr. Harrison. His voice was as dry and crackling as old parchment, but his mind was as sharp as a razor. "Evelyn," he said, "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. I read the trust reports every month. I see the payments go out. I assume all has been well?" "Things have changed, Arthur," I said. "They want to put me in a home." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, well, damn it all. I knew that daughter-in-law was a piece of work. "What's your play, Evelyn?" "I need you to come to the house. The day after tomorrow, 3 o'clock. Don't tell them you're coming. Just show up. Consider it done," he said. "Do you want me to bring the shock and a portfolio?" "Bring it all, Arthur," I said. "Bring the whole damn war." The next 24 hours were a masterclass in deception. I pretended to be mulling over the Golden Meadows brochure. I asked Sarah questions about the cost, about the meal plans. I let them see me as a woman slowly resigning herself to her fate. It was a nauseating role to play. Sarah was smugly triumphant. She started talking about what they could do with my room. It would make a perfect home office for me, Mark. I could finally get some real work done without having to use the dining room table. Mark just nodded, his eyes on his phone, avoiding the conversation, avoiding me. He was a coward. and seeing it so clearly hurt more than the betrayal itself. That night, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. I was on my way to get a glass of water, and their voices, low and conspiratorial, floated down the hall. "She seems to be taking it well," Mark said. I was worried she'd put up a fight. "Please, Mark," Sarah scoffed. "What's she going to do? Your mother is not a fighter. She's spent her whole life just agreeing. It's for the best. Once she's settled, we can finally take out that second mortgage. That new development downtown is a golden opportunity. We have to get in on the ground floor. A second mortgage? Sarah, we just got the house. Don't be naive. It's about leveraging our assets. It's what smart people do. We'll be set for life. Lily's college, our retirement. It's all within reach. We just have to get this one last detail sorted out." I backed away silently, my heart pounding like a drum. It wasn't just about getting rid of me. It was about money. They wanted to borrow against the house to use the asset I had provided as collateral for some risky scheme. They would indebt themselves, and when the investment inevitably soured, just like it had for David, they would lose everything. The house, the security, the future I had sacrificed my own fortune to build for them. My promise to David wasn't just to give Mark a home. It was to protect him from the very kind of financial ruin that had destroyed his father. And Sarah was leading him right over the same cliff. My quiet resolve hardened into a diamond-sharp certainty. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for my son's future and for the memory of my husband. I found something else that night. Unable to sleep, I was tidying up the living room, a habit I couldn't break. I noticed Sarah's laptop was open on the coffee table. I'd never snooped before in my life, but tonight was different. The screen was on a real estate website. They weren't just planning a second mortgage. They had been looking at the property value, at recent sales in the neighborhood. And in another tab, an email was open. It was to her sister. My eyes scanned the words and the breath left my body. Finally getting the old lady out. "The house is worth twice what we paid for it. Once she's in the home, we'll have her sign over power of attorney for her own good. Mark is squeamish, but he'll do what I say. A few months, a year at most, and we sell this place, cash out, and move to the coast. The life we deserve, power of attorney. Sell the house, move to the coast." It was a coup, a long-planned, cold-blooded takeover of my life and my legacy. My blood ran cold. The woman my son had married wasn't just greedy. She was a predator, and I had been living in her den, completely unaware. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking. The quiet, agreeable Evelyn they knew was gone. She had died right there, in the silent living room, under the glow of a computer screen. The woman who remained was someone they had never met, and she was about to burn their world to the ground. The next day, I suggested we have a family meeting in the afternoon to discuss my decision. Sarah was thrilled, assuming I was going to formally surrender. "What a wonderful idea, Evelyn," she said, patting my hand. "We're all so proud of you for being so sensible about this." I gave her a small, tight smile. "I just want to make sure we're all on the same page," I said. The hidden meaning was lost on her. At 2:45, I went to my room and put on the navy blue dress I had worn to David's funeral. It was a dress of quiet strength and deep sorrow. It felt appropriate. I then retrieved a small, locked metal box from the back of my closet. Inside it was my copy of every document, every bank statement, every piece of the puzzle. I was ready. Subscribe now, you won't believe the twist that's coming. At 3 o'clock, we were all assembled in the living room. Sarah had even poured iced tea, as if this were a civilized negotiation. She and Mark sat on the large, plush sofa, a united front. I sat opposite them in a wing-back chair, the metal box on the floor beside me. The chair felt like a throne. "So, Mom," Mark began, taking a nervous sip of tea. "We're glad you wanted to talk." "Yes," Sarah chimed in, her smile bright and false. "We want this transition to be as smooth and comfortable for you as possible." "I'm sure you do," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "But before I tell you my decision about Golden Meadows, there's something else we need to discuss." "The house?" Sarah's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "The house? What about it?" "I've been thinking a lot about how you came to own this house," I continued, letting the words hang in the air. "It was quite a miracle, wasn't it?" The bank turning you down repeatedly, and then suddenly, a massive loan approval comes through. It's a wonderful story. The story of the hardworking young couple who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Mark shifted uncomfortably. Mom, what's this about? We worked hard. We saved. Did you? I asked, my gaze locking onto his. Did you save enough for a $500,000 down payment? Did your salaries suddenly triple to cover the mortgage on a house in this neighborhood? The air in the room grew thick with tension. Sarah put her glass down with a sharp click. Evelyn, I don't know what you're implying, but this is our house. We have the deed. We make the payments. That, I said, leaning forward slightly, is where you are mistaken. Just then, the doorbell rang. A triumphant little chime that signaled the arrival of my cavalry. Mark, looking confused and annoyed by the interruption, went to answer it a moment later. He returned, followed by a man who seemed to be made of tweed and righteous indignation. Mr. Harrison, I said with a nod. Thank you for coming. Arthur Harrison? Sarah said, her voice sharp with suspicion. My mother's lawyer? What is he doing here? Your mother, Mr. Harrison said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves, invited me to this family meeting. I believe I have some documents that will be relevant to the discussion. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick file, placing it on the coffee table with a thud that echoed in the silent room. Mark looked from the file to me, a dawning horror on his face. Mom? What is this? This was it. The moment I had both dreaded and yearned for. The end of the lie. This, I said, my voice ringing with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, is the truth. I stood up and opened my own metal box, pulling out a sheaf of papers. Sarah, you are right about one thing. You don't make the mortgage payments. You make a payment, yes. A small one, to a holding account. But the actual mortgage, the full amount, has been paid every single month for the last 7 years by a trust. The David Miller Memorial Trust. I let that sink in. David's name, spoken in this context, was a ghost at the table. Mr. Harrison stepped forward. The trust, he explained in his lawyerly monotone, was established by Mrs. Miller 9 years ago following the death of her husband. It was funded by a personal asset she held. The trust provided the initial down payment of $500,000 for this property and has been servicing the debt ever since. The deed is technically held by the trust, with Mr. and Mrs. Miller listed as residents, not owners. He slid a document across the table. It was the trust agreement. Sarah snatched it up, her face pale, her eyes scanning the page frantically. Mark just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, looking like a little boy who had just been told there was no Santa Claus. But why? He stammered. Why would you do that? And so I told him. I told him everything. I told him about his father's financial ruin, the shame that ate him alive. I told him about David's dying wish, the promise I had made to protect him. I told him about the insurance policy, the secret lifeline that I chose to use not for myself, but to build this foundation for him, for his family. I did it because my husband died believing he was a failure who had left his family with nothing. I said, my voice cracking for the first time. I wanted his son to have the one thing he couldn't provide. A secure home, a life without the fear of losing everything. I didn't want your father's legacy to be one of failure. I wanted it to be this. This house, your success. Tears were streaming down Mark's face now. He wasn't crying for the house. He was crying for the father he thought he knew, and for the mother he was only just beginning to see. He looked at his hands, at his expensive watch, at the life he had built, and saw the invisible scaffolding that had held it all up. My sacrifice, my silence. You paid for it all, he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief and a terrible, dawning shame. All this time. I thought I did this. I looked at my son, my heart breaking for him, for the lie he had lived, a lie I had authored out of love. This was my collapse moment, too. The moment I realized that in trying to protect him from his father's truth, I had robbed him of his own. But before I could say anything, Sarah erupted. Her face was no longer pale. It was a mask of pure fury. You liar, she shrieked, throwing the trust document onto the table. This is insane. This was never our house. It was always yours. You've been holding it over our heads this whole time, playing the poor little widow in the guest room. You controlled us. You controlled everything. The venom in her voice was shocking. There was no gratitude, no shame, only rage. And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It wasn't just about greed. She had felt like an imposter in her own life. On some subconscious level, she must have known this was all too good to be true, and she had resented me for it. She hadn't wanted a foundation. She had wanted to build the house herself, no matter how shoddy. Control? I said, my voice rising to meet hers, the full force of my own suppressed anger finally breaking free. I gave you a home. I gave your daughter a garden to play in and a safe street to ride her bike on. I gave my son a life free of the crushing worry that killed his father. All I asked for in return was a small room and a place in my own family's life. You call that control. I called it love. What you plan to do to me, selling my home from under me and putting me away to die, what do you call that, Sarah? Smart asset management? The ugly truth of her email, of her plan, hung in the air between us. Mark looked from me to his wife, his face a canvas of horror and confusion. He saw it all now. He saw her for what she truly was. Sarah, he whispered. Is that true? The power of attorney. Selling the house? Sarah's rage deflated, replaced by a cold, hard defiance. She straightened her shoulders and looked at him, her eyes like chips of ice. We deserved it, Mark. We worked hard. She owed it to us, and that was it. The final, damning admission. She believed we were owed a life, that my sacrifice wasn't a gift, but a debt she was collecting. Mark let out a sound that was half a sob, half a gasp. He stood up, stumbling back from the sofa, away from his wife. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a profound, soul-shattering regret. Mom, he choked out. I am so sorry. He finally understood. The choice was clear. It was never between a house and a retirement home. It was between his wife's bottomless greed and his mother's unconditional love. And in that terrible, clarifying moment, his marriage crumbled into dust. The weeks that followed were quiet. Sarah packed her things and left within 2 days, her departure as cold and efficient as her ambition. There were no tears, no dramatic farewells, just the sound of suitcases rolling on the hardwood floors and the click of the front door closing for the last time. The house, which had once seemed so full, suddenly felt cavernous. The silence was heavy with unspoken words and regrets. Mark walked through the rooms like a ghost, his face etched with a shame so deep I worried it might break him. He barely spoke, but his actions spoke for him. He started making me breakfast every morning. He sat with me in the evenings, not watching television, but just sitting, as if my presence was a penance he needed to serve. Mr. Harrison handled the legalities. The trust had a clause, a fail-safe he had insisted on, that in the event of an attempt to remove me from the property or sell it against the trust's interests, full ownership would revert directly to me. The house was now officially and unequivocally in my name. One evening, about a month after Sarah had left, Mark found me in the garden, weeding the roses. He stood there for a long time before speaking. I don't know how I can ever fix this, Mom. We can start by telling the truth, I said softly, not looking up from the flower bed. To ourselves. And to Lily, that was the hardest part. Explaining to a 7-year-old that her mother was gone, that her world had been turned upside down because of grown-up mistakes she couldn't possibly understand. But we did it together. We told her that we were a family and that families sometimes break, but that the love for her would never, ever change. The house began to feel like a home again, slowly. It wasn't the loud, bustling place it had been. It was something new. Quieter, more thoughtful. Mark started working from home more often, his priorities shifting away from the corporate ladder and toward his daughter. He was becoming the man his father had always wanted him to be, not through financial success, but through character. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Lily and I were planting new flowers in the garden. Her little hands, covered in dirt, carefully placed a pansy into the soil. She looked up at me, her brow furrowed in concentration. Grandma, she said, are you going to stay here now? Forever? I stopped what I was doing and looked around. I saw the sturdy brick of the house, the green expanse of the lawn, the tire swing hanging from the old oak tree that David and I had planted in our first home, a sapling I'd insisted on bringing here. This wasn't just a house bought with money. It was a home built on a promise, purchased with a secret, and finally reclaimed by love. I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. Yes, sweetie, I said, my voice thick with emotion. This is our home, and I'm staying forever. Comment which part of the story left you speechless.